For more than 2 years, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have been raising the same alarm. They claim France and Ukraine are not helping the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. They are fueling it. But the world refused to listen. Critics said it was nothing more than a distraction, a story invented by military leaders to cover up the insecurity eating away at their countries. Now, the silence has ended. The Alliance of Sahel States has chosen a different path. They are taking France and Ukraine to the International Court of Justice, not just with words, but with accusations sharp enough to shake the global stage. The charge is grave: supporting terrorism. This is no longer politics. It's about justice, survival, and the right to be heard. The question is simple, yet explosive. Will the world finally take notice? And if the evidence holds, could France and Ukraine be forced to stand trial? The Sahel has spoken, and this time, the world cannot look away. On September 15th, something significant unfolded in Niamey, the capital of Niger. Justice ministers from the Alliance of Sahel States gathered for only their second official meeting since the bloc was created. Behind closed doors, the discussions were tense, but when the meeting ended, a decision emerged that could shake international politics. Niger's Minister of Interior and Decentralization, Mohamed Toumba, stood before delegates and delivered the announcement. The AES had agreed to prosecute France and Ukraine at the International Court of Justice. The charge: supporting terrorism in the Sahel. His words were deliberate, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Toumba went further. He praised national courts for already taking action against France 24, RFY, and TV5 Monde, media outlets accused of crossing a dangerous line. According to the AES, their reporting did more than inform. It justified terrorism. For the ministers, this wasn't just about governments. It was about the influence of media shaping narratives that kept the region unstable. The meeting didn't end with accusations. The ministers also revisited the roadmap adopted months earlier in Bamako. On the table were bold plans: creating a Sahel criminal court and a human rights court, constructing a high-security prison, and breaking free from reliance on international institutions long dominated by outside powers. What happened in Niamey was more than another diplomatic gathering. It was a declaration of intent, a signal that the Sahel would no longer play defense. It would fight its battles in court, on its own terms, and in front of the world. But why has the AES decided to take such a bold step? The answer lies in years of growing anger and frustration. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have long accused France of doing the unthinkable, supporting terrorism in the Sahel instead of fighting it. Last year, during the United Nations General Assembly, that accusation was brought to the world stage. In front of hundreds of world leaders, Niger's foreign minister didn't hold back. He declared that France was directly responsible for fueling terrorism and insecurity in the Sahel. And the most striking part? France was sitting right there in the room when the words were spoken. Representing the AES alliance, Niger's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Bakary Yahou Sangaré, delivered a message that cut deep. He denounced what he called France's new recolonization strategy. A strategy, he said, built on sponsoring the very forces that kept the Sahel burning. He began his address by laying out the painful truth. For more than a decade, the Sahel has been gripped by a devastating security crisis. Attacks, displacement, fear, and instability have scarred the region. And according to the AES, this wasn't just chaos. It was a system designed and sustained by France itself. According to Niger's foreign minister, the security crisis has grown so severe that it threatens the very existence of some states, including Niger itself. And then, staring directly at Western leaders, he made an accusation that stunned the room. He declared that the crisis has dragged on for so many years because certain Western powers have been supporting it, using terrorism as a tool to control the Sahel and its affairs. But he didn't stop there. The minister made it clear that Niger and the AES alliance condemn these hostile acts in the strongest terms. And with boldness rarely seen on such a stage, he named France as the architect of what he called a new recolonization strategy. He accused Paris of informing, training, financing, and even arming the very groups terrorizing the Sahel. It was a striking moment, the kind of statement that forces the world to take notice. Yet, As powerful as it was, this was not the first time France had faced such accusations in the halls of the United Nations. The claim that Paris has a hidden hand in the violence of the Sahel has been raised before, but this time, the voices behind it were louder, united, and determined to be heard. In 2023, during the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Mali's Prime Minister delivered a message that shook the room. He revealed that his government had gone as far as writing a formal letter to the United Nations Security Council, accusing France of directly financing and arming terrorist groups in the Sahel. It was a bold claim, and one that would never have been made in France's presence if there hadn't been evidence to back it. Yet, despite the letter, despite the address before world leaders, the Security Council gave no response. Silence followed. And this is the heart of the frustration. For years, the AES countries have cried out, but the world has refused to listen. Their warnings, their accusations, have been brushed aside as noise. But here's where it gets even more explosive. France is not the only one in the crosshairs. Ukraine has also been accused of supporting terrorism in the Sahel, and the evidence, according to the AES, is recent and undeniable. A few months ago, Tuareg rebels, who have been destabilizing Mali since 2012, launched one of their deadliest attacks yet. Over 3 days of intense fighting, at least 84 Russian mercenaries and 47 Malian soldiers were killed. It was a staggering loss. And just as Mali was reeling from the bloodshed, Ukraine's role suddenly became clear. Andriy Yusov, spokesperson for Ukraine's military intelligence agency, went on national television and admitted it. He told Suspilne, Ukraine's public broadcaster, that the Malian rebels had received all the information they needed to carry out the operation against what he called Russian war criminals. He didn't hesitate. He didn't hide behind vague language. He stated plainly, Ukraine gave the rebels the intelligence they needed to strike, and to strike successfully. To make matters worse, the Tuareg rebels themselves left no room for doubt. They published an appeal to Ukrainians, written in Ukrainian. In it, they expressed solidarity with Ukraine in its fight against Russia, and even went as far as offering to hand over captured Wagner mercenaries. When you piece this together, 2 questions immediately rise. How did the authorities in Ukraine know that the Tuareg rebels had received the intelligence needed for such a devastating strike? And why would the rebels openly pledge solidarity with Ukraine unless there was already a hidden connection? The answer, to the AES countries, was obvious. Ukraine had provided the information. There was no other explanation. Of course, Ukrainian officials denied the accusations, but their denial was thin, unconvincing, and did little to calm suspicions in Bamako or Niamey. For Mali and Niger, the evidence was too clear, the connections too strong, and so both countries took a drastic step. They cut off diplomatic ties with Ukraine, citing its support for terrorist groups as the reason. But the AES member countries did not stop there. They took their frustration one step further, writing and sending a letter to the United Nations Security Council. In that letter, they condemned Ukraine's support for the Tuareg rebels who have plunged Mali into chaos and insecurity for more than a decade. The evidence, they insisted, was undeniable. Even Ukrainian officials had spoken the words themselves. And yet, the response from the Security Council was the same as before. Nothing. The letter, like the others written earlier by Mali's Prime Minister accusing France of aiding terrorism, was left to gather dust in silence. This is why, in earlier videos, we warned that the AES leaders were wasting their time writing letters. Ukraine, just like other Western powers accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, would face no sanctions, no penalties, no investigations. Why? The reason is painfully simple. The West controls the Security Council. Not a single African country sits there to defend Africa's voice. And so, the pattern repeats. When accusations are leveled against the West, nothing happens. But if the same charge were directed at an African nation, the reaction would be immediate. Within hours, the world would hear of sanctions, condemnations, and punishments. How many times have you heard of a Western country being sanctioned for its crimes? Almost never. It is always the global South that pays the price. And to the AES, This double standard is not just unfair, it is the very definition of hypocrisy. All of these reasons explain why Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have now chosen to take France and Ukraine before the International Court of Justice. But there's another dimension to this battle. Why is the AES also considering lawsuits against Western media outlets like France 24, RFI, and TV5 Monde? What role did they play? To answer that, we need to go back to last year. The AES bloc made a bold move. They launched their own web TV channel. Its purpose was clear: to counter what they described as fake news from Western media. For months, the 3 member states have accused Western outlets of attacking them with distorted narratives and biased reporting. And here's the crucial point. It was never just about the fact that these countries are under military rule. If that were the true reason, then the same media storm would have been directed at Gabon, Guinea, or Chad, where military leaders also hold power. But that didn't happen. The real reason lies in something much deeper. The leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso shattered the old geopolitical order of the Sahel. For decades, the region was firmly under Western influence, with France and the United States holding the reins of power. But after the wave of coups, the new leaders who rose were not cut from the same cloth. They were not civilian puppets of the West. They were different, and they made it clear they would no longer bow to outside control. The use of Western media to create false narratives about Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is precisely why the 3 countries decided to push back. Words, after all, can be as dangerous as weapons. And when those words are used to undermine governments and embolden terrorists, the AES leaders believed they had no choice but to act. In 2022, Mali made its first bold move. The High Authority of Communication announced the permanent suspension of France 24 television and RFI radio, 2 of France's most influential media outlets in Africa. The decision sent shockwaves through the international community, but Mali wasn't finished. On July 27, 2024, the French television channel LCI was suspended for 2 months. Then, just a few weeks later in September 2024, another French broadcaster was taken off the air for violating Mali's media regulations. For Bamako, the message was clear. Any outlet that pushed biased narratives or destabilizing content would no longer be welcome. Burkina Faso followed suit. In October 2024, President Ibrahim Traoré personally announced the suspension of The Voice of America, a media house funded by the United States. It was the latest step in Traoré's escalating campaign against what he called Western propaganda, targeting not only Burkina Faso, but also Mali and Niger. The decision came after a heated debate aired on VOA on September 19, 2024. In that program, panelists commented on the worsening security crisis across the Sahel. But what struck a nerve was their language. According to Burkina Faso's Supreme Communications Council, some participants described recent terrorist attacks in Bamako as courageous. That one word was enough to ignite fury. The council accused VOA of undermining the morale of both Burkinabe and Malian soldiers, men and women risking their lives every day on the front lines. For Traoré, this wasn't simply about media freedom. It was about defending sovereignty. When reporting crossed the line from journalism to justification, when it emboldened enemies and weakened the resolve of soldiers, it became, in his eyes, an act of hostility. And in the eyes of the AES, the West's narrative war had gone too far. For this reason, Burkina Faso's Supreme Communications Council, the CSC, issued a sweeping order. It announced that all synchronizations of national and international media will be suspended until further notice. In practice, this meant that local media outlets could no longer rely on foreign news sources to shape their reporting. Burkina Faso was cutting the cord. And when you examine the CSC's statement closely, the government's decision begins to make sense. The armed group JNIM, responsible for launching a violent assault on the capital, Bamako, an attack that left civilians dead and soldiers injured, was described as courageous. Instead of condemning terror, the debate seemed to dignify it. To the AES, this was more than bias. It was complicity. When respected international broadcasters echoed language that framed terrorists as heroes, it crossed the line into supporting violence. And so, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso responded with force, suspensions, restrictions, and now the threat of lawsuits. But this leaves us with a larger, unanswered question. Will dragging France and Ukraine before the International Court of Justice truly yield results? Will slamming lawsuits against Western media stop them from creating narratives that weaken Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? Or will the machinery of global power, rooted in Western control, make sure nothing changes? The Sahel has drawn its battle lines. The courtroom may now become the next battlefield. In our view, the answer to these questions is clear. Nothing will change. And here's why. On paper, the International Court of Justice is supposed to be the world's highest legal authority. It is meant to be an independent body, empowered to prosecute governments for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and even state-sponsored terrorism. In an ideal world, if the AES can present solid evidence, then yes, France and Ukraine could be prosecuted. Justice would prevail. But the painful truth is that we do not live in an ideal world. In reality, the West holds the strings of the ICJ, and history has shown us again and again that this court is used to prosecute African nations and non-Western states, while Western powers remain untouchable. The hypocrisy became clear just last year when South Africa took Israel to court. South Africa won. The International Court of Justice ruled in its favor and went as far as ordering the arrest of the Israeli Prime Minister. But what happened next? The United States was outraged that its ally had been dragged into court by an African country. Washington retaliated by slapping sanctions on South Africa. And most recently, the US even sanctioned the ICJ prosecutors who dared to issue the arrest warrant. It doesn't end there. A few months ago, a senior ICJ official made a shocking admission. He revealed that top Western officials had told him directly, the ICJ was created for African countries and thugs like Putin, not for the West, not for their allies. And today, the verdict against Israel still sits unenforced. Why? Because without US support, international justice stalls. It's a painful reminder that the ICJ, though powerful in name, bends in practice to the will of those who control the world order. What does this tell you? The ICJ is powerless before the West. Even though Trump is not really a fan of Ukraine's president right now, it still doesn't change the fact that Ukraine is an ally of the West, just like France is a Western country. So, taking these countries to court would not yield any meaningful results. But perhaps it might expose the hypocrisy of these countries and expose them to international embarrassment. In our opinion, the AES countries should forget about taking France and Ukraine to court and focus on building their countries. This is the best response they can give to these countries. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.